The sun had already begun to sink behind the far hills when the little girl stepped onto the dusty main road of Pine Hollow. Her boots were too big for her feet, and her dress was patched at the elbows and hem, but she held herself with quiet courage. In her small hand was a silver ring, dulled with time but shining faintly in the light. The townsfolk passed her by without a glance. They had their own troubles, their own mouths to feed. But she stood there, her eyes steady, waiting. When a man in a fancy vest stopped by the general store, she approached him timidly. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind, "would you buy my mama's ring? We need food." The man laughed, shaking his head. "Go on, kid. I don't buy junk." He walked away, leaving her standing in the red dust, clutching the ring tighter as if to hold on to what little hope she had left. Across the street, a tall man in a weathered hat watched quietly. He leaned against a post outside the saloon, a toothpick between his teeth and a shadow in his eyes that came from years of seeing too much. His name was Cole Lawson, a rancher, a widower, and a man who had learned to read the weight in people's eyes. He saw it now in the little girl, the kind of sadness that didn't belong to childhood. When she turned to walk away, her head bowed, he crossed the road in a few long strides. "Miss," he called gently. She stopped, startled, clutching the ring like she might lose it. He knelt so they were eye to eye. "What's your name?" he asked. "Annie," she said softly. "Annie what?" "Just Annie," she replied, her lip trembling. "Mama says last names don't matter much when you're hungry." Cole swallowed hard. "And where's your mama now?" She pointed toward the far end of town. "In the shed behind the old blacksmith's place. She got sick. Been trying to find work, but no one'll hire her." Her voice broke then, and tears streaked the dust on her cheeks. "I was just gonna sell her ring so we could eat. It's the only thing she has left from before Daddy died." Cole looked at the small silver band in her hand, the initials faint but still visible. He took a deep breath and said, "That ring doesn't belong in a pawn shop, sweetheart. It belongs on your mama's hand." Annie blinked at him, confused. "But, sir, we don't got nothin'. Cole stood up and tipped his hat. "Maybe not yet," he said, "but let's see what we can do about that." He led her down the road, past the dusty storefronts and the staring eyes of townsfolk who'd long forgotten what kindness looked like. The blacksmith's shed was just as she'd said. A broken roof, a torn blanket for a door, and a woman inside coughing weakly on a bed of straw. Her face was pale, her hair tangled, but when she saw her daughter with the stranger, she sat up, alarmed. "Annie, you shouldn't bother folks." "She wasn't both Aaron me, ma'am," Cole said gently, taking off his hat. "Name's Cole Lawson. I run a ranch about 10 miles west. I just came to see if you needed a hand." The woman's eyes filled with shame. "We don't take charity." Cole nodded slowly. "Didn't offer any. I'm off errand work." He glanced around the shed. "I could use someone to help with sewing, cooking, that kind of thing. Pays fair." The woman hesitated. "And what about my girl?" "She'll stay with you. The ranch has got plenty of space. You both can come if you're willin'." Annie looked up at her mother, her little hands clasped together. "Please, Mama. Maybe God sent him." That night, one evening, when a storm rolled in from the mountains, thunder shaking the windows, Annie sat beside him on the porch and asked, "Why do folks say bad things about good people?" Cole sighed. "Because kindness scares 'em, darlin'. It reminds them of what they stopped doing." She nodded thoughtfully, staring into the lightning-flashed horizon. "Then I'll be kind forever," she said simply. He smiled. "I reckon that's the bravest thing a person can be." Weeks turned to months, and the ranch began to feel alive again. Flowers blooming where there had been dust, laughter where there had been silence. Grace regained her strength and started helping Cole manage the household. She cooked, kept the books, and mended clothes with the skill of someone who'd once known better days. Annie thrived under the wide-open sky, her cheeks pink with health, her laughter echoing across the fields. Then one afternoon, as they sat together by the river, Grace said softly, "I don't think we can ever repay you." Cole looked at her, his expression tender. You already have. You reminded me what life's for. She smiled faintly, the sunlight catching her eyes. You gave us a home, Mr. Lawson, but you gave Annie her childhood back. He tipped his hat, his voice gentle. And you gave this place a soul again. That night, as the fire crackled inside the little cabin, Annie slipped the silver ring back onto her mother's hand. Now it can stay where it belongs, she said. Grace pulled her into her arms, tears in her eyes. Cole watched from the doorway, feeling something in his chest he hadn't felt in years, peace. Out on the porch, the storm had cleared. The stars shone over the valley, and the air smelled of rain and earth. Cole stood there a long time, hat in hand, knowing that sometimes salvation didn't come with thunder or miracles. It came with a small girl holding a ring, and the courage to ask for help when the world turned away. And somewhere deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning of their story. The days rolled on in Pine Hollow, slow and golden, like honey poured from the edge of summer. The mornings started with the smell of biscuits baking and the sound of Annie humming to the chickens. Grace would step out of the cabin, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, breathing in the sweet air and whispering a quiet thank you to the heavens. Cole would already be out in the pasture, fixing fences or saddling his horse. He always tipped his hat when she waved, the small gesture that said more than words ever could. It wasn't long before Grace started to notice how he lingered at the porch after supper, how Annie's laughter seemed to light up his weary face, how a quiet comfort had begun to bloom between them, a feeling neither of them dared to name. But life in Pine Hollow wasn't kind to second chances. The gossip didn't stop, it only grew sharper. The town storekeeper, Mrs. Reddick, told anyone who'd listen that Grace must have planned it all, that she'd tricked a lonely cowboy into pity. Even the preacher's wife gave disapproving looks whenever Cole came to town with Annie riding on his shoulders. But he never let it show. When Annie asked why people glared, Cole would say, "They don't see what I see, that's all." And Grace, though her pride ached, would whisper, "Let them talk, sweetheart. The truth don't need defending." Still, some nights she'd cry quietly when the lamp was low, afraid she didn't belong in this world of barns and broad skies, afraid that no matter how much work she did, the town would never forgive her for being poor. One afternoon, Cole rode into town for supplies. He overheard two ranch hands laughing near the blacksmith's shop. "That Lawson fella's lost his mind," one said. "Taking in strays like that. He'll regret it soon enough." Cole stopped, his jaw tight. He could have walked away, but something in him snapped. The memory of seeing Annie clutching that ring in the street, the way Grace had refused charity even when starving. He turned and looked them square in the eyes. "You boys ever go hungry a day in your life?" They stared, surprised. "Didn't think so," Cole said, voice low. "Then maybe you don't know what real strength looks like." The men went silent as he walked away, boots thudding heavy in the dust. That winter. Then one morning the peace was broken. A knock came hard on the cabin door. Cole opened it to find Sheriff McGraw standing there, snow on his hat, a stern look on his face. "Mornin', Lawson," the sheriff said. "Heard some talk in town. Folks are sayin' that woman ain't who she says she is." Cole frowned. "Grace, ain't sayin' I believe it," the sheriff continued. "But folks claim she used to be married to a gambler down south, one who skipped town after cheating half the county." Grace stepped forward, pale but steady. "That's true," she said quietly. "But he's gone now. He left us with nothin' but debt and shame. I came here to start over." The sheriff nodded, his eyes softening. "I figured as much. But I had to ask." Cole's hand tightened on the doorframe. "You done a skin?" he said coldly. McGraw tipped his hat. "Yeah, Lawson. I'm done." When he left, Grace sank onto the chair, trembling. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered. "I didn't want my past to ruin your kindness." Cole knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "Grace," he said, his voice low and fierce, "you don't owe anyone an explanation, not for surviving." She looked up at him then, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You really believe people can start again?" He smiled faintly. I believe people like you are the reason second chances exist." From that day, something changed between them. The silence they once shared became softer, full of unspoken care. When Grace fell ill one night, Cole stayed up by her bedside, wiping her brow, whispering stories to keep her from drifting away. When Annie had nightmares, he'd carry her out to the porch, showing her the stars and telling her that every one of them was a wish that came true for someone brave enough to believe. Spring returned with the scent of wildflowers, and with it came new hope. The ranch thrived again. Cole's herd grew strong, and neighbors who once gossiped now came asking for his help fixing fences or trading cattle. Grace became known for her baking, and folks began to smile when she passed in town. One afternoon, as Cole and Annie painted the fence, she looked up and said, "Mr. Lawson, when I grow up, I want to be like you." He laughed softly. "And what's that, little miss?" "Someone who makes people safe." His heart swelled. "You already are, Annie. You made me safe first." One golden evening, when the sky turned pink and the wind smelled like rain, Grace stood beside Cole at the edge of the pasture. "I never thought peace could feel this loud," she said. "Like the whole world finally stopped running." He nodded. "That's what home sounds like." She turned to him, her eyes warm. "You gave us a home, Cole." He met her gaze and said quietly, "No, Grace, you gave this place life again." When Annie came running from the cabin, waving her mama's ring in the air, laughing, the two adults couldn't help but smile. Grace took the ring, slid it back onto her finger, and whispered, "It's right where it belongs." Cole watched her hand glint in the sunlight and felt a peace he hadn't known since his own wife passed years ago. The years ahead would not be easy. No story worth living ever was. But that night, as they sat by the fire with the sound of the river humming in the distance, Cole realized something simple and sacred. Sometimes, family wasn't born, it was chosen. Sometimes it started with a little girl selling her mama's ring, and ended with three hearts finding home in the middle of nowhere. And for the first time in a long, long while, Cole Lawson thanked God for a second chance. Summer rolled back over Pine Hollow like a golden tide. The meadows turned bright with wildflowers, the air buzzing with bees and laughter. Grace was stronger now, her cheeks fuller, her smile warmer, and Annie had grown a few inches taller, always barefoot, always humming. The cabin that once felt like a stranger's kindness had turned into a true home. The walls smelled of cedar and cinnamon, and the porch rail was worn smooth from Cole's hands. But even in that peace, there were echoes of things unspoken, feelings tucked away behind polite smiles and gentle gestures. Every morning, Cole would ride out to mend fences or check the herd. Grace would watch from the doorway, shading her eyes with one hand. When he disappeared into the hills, her heart would twist with a feeling she couldn't name. Sometimes, she'd whisper softly to herself, "Don't go too far." He never heard her, but somehow he always came back before sunset, dusted with the day's work, carrying that same calm steadiness that made her feel safe. One evening, a storm rolled in sudden and wild. The sky went dark as iron, wind slapping the trees. Grace ran out to pull in the laundry, and Cole caught her hand. "Get inside," he said firmly, his voice nearly lost in the thunder. "I'll handle it." Lightning split the sky, white as bone, and for a moment Grace saw the old fear flash in her mind. Cold nights when no one had come, when every sound meant danger. But this time she wasn't alone. She watched him move through the rain, muscles straining as he tied the barn doors shut, his coat soaked through. When he came back in, dripping and shivering, Annie wrapped him in a blanket while Grace knelt to warm his hands by the fire. And when the storm passed, the land woke green and clean. Rivers swelled with new life, and the scent of wet earth filled the valley. The townsfolk started visiting more often now, some to trade, others to apologize in quiet ways. The same women who once whispered behind Grace's back began asking for her recipes, bringing fabric for Annie's dresses. Even the preacher stopped by one Sunday with a basket of apples, saying, "Seems the Lord knew what he was doing after all." Cole only smiled, tipping his hat. But peace, as always, came with its trials. One afternoon, a stranger rode into town, a man with slick hair, a city coat, and a grin that never reached his eyes. He asked questions about a woman and a little girl. When the sheriff mentioned Grace's name, the man smirked. "Well, I'll be. Looks like she's been hidin'." The sheriff didn't like his tone. "Who are you?" "Name's Maddox," the man replied. "Used to be married to her." By the time word reached the ranch, Cole had already saddled his horse. Grace was pale, her hands trembling as she packed a small bag. "He's dangerous, Cole," she whispered. "He used to own everything I had, even my name." Cole put a hand on her shoulder. "You're not running again," he said firmly. "Not this time. But Annie, she's safe here. With me." That evening, Maddox rode up the long dirt road toward the cabin, spurs jingling. Grace stood on the porch, her face still but her heart pounding like thunder. Cole stepped out beside her, calm as a mountain. "Evening," he said. Maddox sneered. "Ain't you the hero cowboy? You're keeping my wife, are ya?" Grace's voice shook but stayed steady. "You left me. You sold everything we had and left me to starve." Maddox laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "That's what happens when folks forget their place." Cole took a step forward. "Her place is here. You got no claim." Maddox's eyes glinted. "You think a court'll see it that way?" Cole didn't flinch. "I don't answer to a court that lets men like you walk free." The wind rustled through the trees. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Maddox spat at the ground. "You'll regret this." He turned and rode off into the dusk. Grace's knees gave out, and Cole caught her before she fell. "It's over," he murmured. "He won't touch you again." But deep down he knew Maddox wasn't done. 2 nights later, the barn went up in flames. The horses screamed, and the air filled with smoke. Cole ran into the fire, coughing, shouting for the animals, pulling ropes loose while Grace and Annie threw water from buckets. When it was over, 2 horses were gone, and Cole's arm was burned raw. Grace knelt beside him, sobbing. "He did this, didn't he?" Cole nodded slowly. "He's trying to scare us off." The next morning, Cole went to town to speak with the sheriff. "We'll catch him," McGraw said. "But you best keep the women close." And that's exactly what Cole did. He built a new fence higher than before and kept his rifle close by the door. Yet he refused to live in fear. When Annie asked if the bad man was gone, he smiled and said, "Fear only wins when we stop living, sugar." As weeks passed, Maddox disappeared as suddenly as he'd come. No one saw him again. The ranch slowly healed. Grass grew over the blackened earth, and new foals were born in spring. One morning, as Grace hung clothes under the sun, Cole walked over, his hat low. "I've been thinkin'," he said, "about what comes next." She turned, her hands stilling on the line. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then took her hand gently. "This place, it ain't just mine anymore. It's ours. You and Annie, you belong here. If you'll have it." Grace blinked, tears glistening in her eyes. "Cole Lawson, are you asking what I think you are?" He smiled that small, quiet smile that always melted her heart. "Reckon I am." Annie came running up just then, squealing, "Mama, did he ask you to marry him?" Cole chuckled. "I was gettin' there." Grace laughed through her tears. "Then yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, the 3 of them sat by the fire. Annie curled up between them, fast asleep, her tiny hand resting in both of theirs. Grace looked at the flames, her voice soft. "You didn't just give us a home, Cole. You gave us back our name." He leaned close, his voice steady. "You were never nameless, Grace. You just needed someone to remind you." Outside, the wind carried the smell of wild sage through the valley. The moon rose high, silvering the land. And from that moment on, the little girl who once sold her mother's ring never had to trade love for survival again. She had a family, a home, and a man who believed that sometimes the greatest fortune in the world wasn't gold or land. It was kindness strong enough to build something whole from what the world tried to break. Autumn came early that year, brushing the valley in gold and fire. The hills around Pine Hollow shimmered like an old painting, the sky wide and patient, the air crisp with the promise of change. Grace woke each morning to the sound of Cole splitting wood and the laughter of Annie feeding chickens just outside the cabin. The little home, once a shelter of strangers, now pulsed with a warmth that only love could build. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen. The steady creak of the porch swing told her that life, real life, had finally begun again. But peace in the Wild West was always fragile, like glass warmed by sunlight. Beneath the calm, the past had a way of finding its voice. Word spread one afternoon that a group of claim men were riding through nearby towns, buying up land from ranchers who couldn't pay their debts. They were backed by rich investors from the east, hungry for rail routes and mining rights. Most ranchers sold what they had for pennies, but Cole's land sat right in the middle of the route they wanted. When a rider brought the offer, Cole folded the paper, placed it on the table and said quietly, "Not for sale." Grace watched him, the muscles in his jaw tight, the calm in his eyes turning to stone. "Cole," she said softly, "if they want it bad enough, they won't take no kindly." He looked up from the paper, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "Grace, everything I ever lost came from runnin'. I'm done runnin'." She reached for his hand, her eyes full of worry and pride. "Then I'll stand with you." A week later, 3 men rode up, strangers in black coats, city accents cutting through the dust. The leader, a tall man with gold cufflinks and a smile too sharp, leaned on his saddle horn. "Mr. Lawson, you're sittin' on progress," he said. "This land's worth more under a rail line than under cattle hooves. We're off-airin' fair money." Cole stepped forward. "It ain't about the money." "Then what's it about?" the man asked. "It's about home," Cole said, steady as the earth beneath him. The man's smile faded. "Careful, Lawson. Progress doesn't take kindly to sentiment." The men rode off, leaving behind more dust than words. But Grace could feel it in her bones, the calm before a storm. That night, the air grew heavy. Clouds rolled low, and the cattle grew restless. Grace stood at the window, watching lightning flicker beyond the hills. Cole came up behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "They'll come again," she said. "Let 'em," he replied quietly. "This land's got more heart than they know." By morning, then, Grace woke to the smell of smoke and the roar of flames outside. The barn was burning again, brighter than before, the heat licking at the sky. Cole grabbed his rifle, shouting for Annie to stay with her mother. "No!" Grace cried. "You'll be killed." He turned to her, eyes fierce. "If I don't stop him now, we'll never have peace." He ran into the dark. Grace fell to her knees, praying louder than the storm. She could hear voices, men shouting, the crack of a gun. Annie clung to her side, sobbing. Then, through the fire and chaos, Cole appeared, dragging one of the men by the collar. The others had fled. The flames raged, but the fight was done. Grace ran to him, tears streaming. "You're bleeding," she cried. He looked down at his arm, grimacing. "Just a scratch. Looks worse than it is." But she knew it wasn't just a scratch. She could see the pain behind his grin. After that night, the valley changed. The story of the fire spread, and something unexpected followed: respect. Folks who once doubted Grace began to speak her name with admiration. The same preacher's wife who once turned away brought food to the cabin and said, "I misjudged you." Grace smiled gently. "You weren't the first." Cole's arm healed slow, but his spirit didn't waver. He worked the land with even more purpose, as if the soil itself depended on him. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, he'd sit by the fire with Grace beside him, their hands barely touching but hearts completely together. "You ever think about what might have happened if I hadn't stopped that day in town?" he asked one night. She smiled softly. "Then I'd have sold my mother's ring to a stranger, and the world would have stayed cold." He looked at her, eyes full of light. "Then I reckon it's the best coin I ever spent." As the first snow began to fall, Cole built Annie a new swing under the big oak. She laughed so hard it echoed through the valley, a sound of pure freedom. Grace stood watching, her hands resting over her heart. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small or invisible. She felt seen, fully, truly seen. The sun dipped low that evening, painting the world in gold. Cole walked up beside her and said, "You know, there's something about this land. It don't give easy, but it gives forever." She nodded, leaning into him. "Just like people worth keepin'." And as the last light touched the cabin, Cole wrapped his arm around Grace, the wind carrying the sound of Annie's laughter into the night. In that small corner of the Wild West, love had built something stronger than greed, stronger than gossip, stronger than the world that once broke them. It built a home, and no fire, no storm, no past could ever take it away again. Spring came gentle and full of promise, with wildflowers blooming over the ashes of old pain. The snow melted from the hills, feeding the streams until they sang again, and Pine Hollow seemed reborn. The grass grew taller, the air smelled of rain and cedar, and life moved with the kind of peace that comes after long battles are finally won. Grace hung linens in the sun, humming softly, while Annie ran barefoot through the meadow chasing butterflies. Cole was out by the corral, his hat tilted low as he brushed down his horse, his shoulders strong and steady against the bright horizon. It had been months since the fire, and though the scars remained on the land, they no longer felt like wounds. They were reminders of survival. The people of Pine Hollow had changed too. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was kindness. Mrs. Reddick, the storekeeper who once gossiped, now sent Annie sweets wrapped in brown paper. Old Thomas taught her how to whittle wood into little animals. Even the preacher's wife, who used to cross the street to avoid Grace, now stopped by the cabin with jars of jam and a warm smile. Grace accepted every kindness with gratitude, never pride. "We can't choose how the world begins to see us," she'd tell Annie, "but we can choose how we see it back." That spring, Cole built something new. A barn twice as large as before, with a loft for Annie to play in and a space set aside for Grace's sewing. "You don't have to do all this," she said one afternoon, watching him hammer boards in the sun. "You and Annie are the reason this place breathes again," he replied. "That's more than enough reason. But the past has a way of whispering, even into peace." One morning, a letter arrived, carried by a post rider from the next county. Cole opened it slowly, his brow furrowed as he read. It was from a lawyer in Denver. Maddox, the man who'd once tried to destroy them, had died in a fight weeks ago. No family, no kin. But in his papers, he'd left behind a deed to land outside the city, titled in Grace's name. Cole stared at the letter for a long time. Grace stood by the door, her heart uneasy. "I don't want anything of his," she said quietly. Cole nodded. "Then we won't take it. We've already got all we need." She smiled faintly, the sunlight catching the lines of peace around her eyes. "Yes," she said, "we do." That summer, Pine Hollow gathered for the county fair, the first one in over a decade. The whole town turned out. Children with sticky fingers from candied apples, men trading cattle stories, women showing off quilts and pies. Grace entered her first pie competition, her heart beating fast as she placed it among the others. Annie tugged her hand, whispering, "You'll win, Mama. You always do." Cole grinned beside her. She ain't wrong. When the judges came around, they took one bite and looked at each other, smiling wide. Grace's pie won first prize. When they announced her name, applause filled the air. Even those who'd once doubted her stood and clapped. Cole lifted Annie high onto his shoulders, shouting, "That's my girl!" Grace laughed through her tears, her heart full to bursting. For the first time, she felt seen not as the woman who'd been saved, but as the woman who'd rebuilt. As the fair ended, a band began to play under the lanterns strung between trees. The air smelled of smoke and sweet hay. Couples danced in the dust, boots kicking rhythm to the fiddle's song. Cole turned to Grace, his hat in hand. "May I?" he asked. She blushed but nodded. His rough palm found hers, and they began to sway slowly, the world falling quiet around them. The townsfolk watched from a distance, their faces soft with respect. Two people once broken, now whole, moving together beneath the stars. Annie watched them too, smiling so wide her dimples showed. One evening, as the sun burned low over the ridge, Cole and Grace sat on the porch watching Annie chase fireflies. The light flickered against her dress, her laughter soft and sweet. "She's growin' fast," Cole said. Grace nodded, her eyes misty. "Sometimes I look at her and wonder if she remembers the days before you found us." "Maybe she does," Cole said. "But I reckon she remembers the love more." Grace turned to him, her heart catching in her throat. "You changed our lives, Cole Lawson." He shook his head. "No, Grace. You gave me one." As the stars came out, the quiet wrapped around them like a blanket. Annie climbed onto Cole's lap, sleepy-eyed. "Tell me the story again," she murmured. "Which one?" Cole asked. "The one where the cowboy found the ring." Grace smiled. "You mean the one where the little girl found hope?" Annie giggled. "That one." Cole took a deep breath, his voice low and warm. "Well, once upon a time, a little girl tried to sell her mama's ring for bread. But instead of coins, she found a home. And instead of pity, she found love. And the man who found her learned that the greatest treasure isn't gold. It's the people who make your heart feel full." Years would pass, and Pine Hollow would grow. New cabins, new families, new stories. But the legend of Hope's Rest would stay. They said it began with a starving little girl and a ring too small to matter, and ended with a family that proved love could build more than any fortune. Some said the ring still hung by the door, a reminder of what had once been almost lost. And on quiet nights, when the wind rustled through the cottonwoods and the stars shimmered over the hills, those who listened close could hear laughter from that cabin. The sound of a man, a woman, and a child who'd once had nothing, now rich in every way that mattered. Years rolled by like the slow rivers that cut through the valley, steady and sure. The cabin that once smelled of smoke and sorrow now held the soft warmth of bread baking and the sound of laughter spilling through its windows. Annie grew into a young woman with her mother's calm eyes and her father's unshakable heart. She learned to ride, to rope, and to read the land as easily as she read her books. The people of Pine Hollow had long stopped whispering about Grace and Cole. Now they called them family. Cole's ranch had become a place of refuge for more than cattle. Orphans, drifters, and widows found work and shelter there. Grace had turned one of the barns into a schoolhouse, where she taught letters and kindness in equal measure. Children who'd never held a pencil learned to write their names beneath her care. When the preacher visited one Sunday and asked why she worked so hard, she smiled and said, "Because once, someone worked this hard to see me as human." Cole never stopped being the quiet strength of the place. He'd rise before dawn, feed the horses, and ride the fence line as the sun climbed. Folks said the land thrived because of the way he looked after it, as if it felt his respect. At night, he'd sit on the porch with Grace, the two of them watching the sky change colors. Sometimes they didn't even speak. They didn't have to. The silence between them was a story of its own, of struggle, forgiveness, and the kind of love that doesn't fade with time. But even peace can tremble when the past comes knocking. One autumn evening, a stranger rode up the trail. His clothes were city-cut, his boots too clean for dirt roads. Annie was the first to see him out by the corral. She called for her father. Cole stepped out, hand resting near his holster, not out of threat but habit. The man dismounted, hat in hand. "Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice even. "My name's Samuel Carter. I'm a lawyer out of Denver. I believe you knew a man named Maddox." The name sent a shadow across the porch. Grace froze in the doorway. "We knew of him," Cole said carefully. The lawyer nodded. "He left behind more than debts. I've been tracing old records. Before his passing, he owned properties obtained through unlawful means. One of those deeds belonged to a woman named Grace Carter." Grace blinked at the sound of her maiden name, one she hadn't spoken in years. "He stole it from your father," the lawyer continued softly. "You're the rightful heir." Grace felt her knees weaken, but Cole's hand steadied her. She shook her head. "That land's gone. It don't matter anymore." The lawyer hesitated. Maybe not the land, but what it stood for does. You can reclaim your name, Mrs. Lawson. She looked out over the field where Annie was brushing a horse, her heart tight with emotion. I already did, she said. The lawyer smiled faintly. Then you're a richer woman than most I've met. He tipped his hat and rode off into the fading light. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She walked outside, barefoot in the grass, the moon spilling silver over everything. Cole followed after a while, his voice low. You all right? She nodded. I just keep thinking about that girl I used to be, the one who tried to sell her mama's ring for food. She thought the world had forgotten her. Cole stepped closer, wrapping an arm around her. Maybe the world did, he said softly. But God didn't, and neither did I. She leaned into him, tears warm on her cheeks. Sometimes I still don't believe we got this far. You earned every step, Grace, he murmured. Every single one. Years later, when Cole's hair turned silver and Annie had children of her own, Hope's Rest became a landmark in the county. Travelers would stop by just to hear the story, the tale of the little girl and the ring, the cowboy who saw worth where others saw nothing, and the woman who turned shame into grace. Grace would smile kindly at them, never proud, just grateful. It ain't about what we were given, she'd say. It's about what we gave back. When Cole passed quietly one spring morning, the town gathered like family. They buried him beneath the oak he'd planted the year Annie was born. The headstone was simple, just as he'd wanted. It read, Cole Lawson, a good man who believed in second chances. Grace sat beside that grave every evening for months, her hand resting on the earth as if holding his one last time. You gave me my name back, she whispered once, and I'll carry it till I see you again. Annie took over the ranch then, strong and gentle just like her parents. The children she taught called her Miss Annie Grace, and she wore that name with pride. She kept her father's hat hanging by the door and her mother's ring close around her neck. The cabin, the barn, the land. They all breathed the memory of love that had endured the storm. And when the sun dipped low behind the hills, travelers said you could still see her, Grace, sitting on that porch, rocking slow, her hair white as snow, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Beside her, the empty chair creaked softly in the wind, as if someone unseen still kept her company. The years drifted on softly, like dust dancing through evening light. Annie's children grew tall among the whispering pines of Hope's Rest, their laughter echoing where sorrow once lived. The ranch stood strong, weathered and proud, just like the people who built it. The walls carried every story ever told, every tear shed, every promise kept. Sometimes at dusk, the children would ask their mother to tell them again about the day a little girl tried to sell her mother's ring for bread. Annie would smile and gather them close, her eyes glimmering in the firelight. It was a hard day, she'd say, but it turned into something beautiful, because sometimes kindness changes everything. They'd listen wide-eyed, picturing the dusty road, the trembling hands, the tall man who saw something worth saving. Annie never told it like a fairy tale. It was truth, and truth held more power than magic. She always ended the same way, her voice soft but sure. That ring wasn't gold. It was hope, and hope will feed a soul longer than any loaf of bread. When Grace finally passed, the town mourned as though they'd lost a queen. She went peacefully in her sleep, her Bible open beside her bed, the ring still resting on her nightstand. They buried her beside Cole, under the oak tree he planted long ago. The same oak that had shaded their laughter, their quiet talks, their growing love. The townsfolk gathered with hats in hand and tears in their eyes, whispering prayers of thanks for the woman who'd taught them all that worth isn't given by wealth, but by heart. Years later, a monument would stand there. A simple plaque that read, Grace and Cole Lawson, they taught us what home means. Travelers passing through would stop and ask the story, and the townspeople would tell it the way it deserved to be told, with pride, reverence, and a touch of wonder. They'd say it began with hunger and ended with a legacy that fed generations. They'd point toward the cabin and say, that's where hope lived. At night, when the valley grew quiet and the stars blinked awake, a soft wind would stir through the grass, brushing over the oak leaves like a whisper. Some said if you stood real still, you could hear laughter carried in the breeze, a woman's gentle hum, a man's low chuckle, and the sound of a little girl's giggle, fading off into forever. And in that place, under the endless western sky, the story of a little girl, a ring, and a cowboy's heart would never die. It would live forever in the soil, in the wind, and in every soul who still believed that the smallest act of compassion could change the whole world.